Wang Huning has served as an important role under Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. Not everyone could survive three very different dynasties. His career somehow seems smooth in the CCP. Were there any specific reasons behind his longevity? Something special in his personality or his temperament?
He seems to be very good at what he does, which again is, sort of taking the issues that the party faces, post Mao. Let's start with post Mao and even post Deng, and translating these into frameworks that make sense for the leadership and also in theory, make sense outside of the party itself. So he plays a role in shaping how the party represents itself. So I think he's had a special kind of talent for fusing ideas of the party with ideas of China as a nation. But what he's done in a sense is he's updated the party's Leninist ideology for the current generation, so to speak. And I think this comes from a very unique part of his background. Wang, when he was an intellectual, even before he had risen to the position that he's risen to, described himself as a reader. And in particular, he was a reader of foreign intellectual and political thought. And so therefore, he had insights, I think, that for the time in which he was forming, I think, his big ideas about culture, cultural sovereignty, cultural security, et cetera. He had a fairly unique perspective on the world of foreign ideas and trends in that area. I think that made him very valuable.
Huning was the visiting scholar in the US in 1988, and he later wrote America Against America based on his own observation. How would you evaluate that book?
Right, so there's a fascinating history there. Of course, that book has, among some circles, become very popular once again. It seems to be popular for two reasons. One is there's an almost prescient diagnosis of the kind of issues that seem to affect the United States today. Now, I think it's only prescient if you forget that during the time that Wang was writing, all of these issues were being widely discussed in the United States as well, And so what Wang's book does, though, now for a contemporary audience, and let's start with what's in Wang's book. He visited the United States. He traveled to multiple cities. He looked at social relations. He looked at sort of what everyday civic life, cultural life, social life looked like. He was very interested in values and ideas. What got people excited, and also in the dysfunctions that he saw around him of American society. And so he put all of this into this book, America Against America. In the process, he also, found a lot about the United States to admire. And, this is coming from his era also. He was very struck by the power of open information and communication. He was struck by everyday details that we wouldn't see as significant now, like community libraries where, anyone could wander in and borrow a book. This, obviously, coming out of China in the 1980s would have been a very novel kind of thing, where libraries were mainly for scholars and very closed. He had that kind of that early information age enthusiasm about all of the connection that he saw going on around him, basically in the United States, and all the information that was moving around. At the end of the day, though, he decides that what he doesn't like at all about the United States is that there's no strong center. And there's too much fragmentation among the various identities, and so his conclusion, which is somewhat of a heresy, is that Japan is a much more interesting country in terms of the model, that Wang ultimately was interested in proposing in that book. And it's because, he saw Japan as combining cultural homogeneity and a strong sense of nation state identity with the economic dynamism and strong civic ethos that he saw in the United States. Even though I think what he saw in the United States was also signs of decline. That people didn't have as much of a national identity as they had sort of like subnational identities. And there was quite a lot he saw that shocked and alarmed him. as well. The difference in cultural values and around issues like drugs and sex and individual freedom. Those were in a sense shocking to him.
So his viewpoints on America and the democracy here make sense. And does it apply to the society 30 years after? How about China's self-claimed democracy?
So what Wang means by democracy, which he does mention at various points in his writings, is, you could argue, really fundamentally in tension with his more authoritarian leanings as well. But ultimately, I think what Wang means by democracy is this idea that all of the members of society should be mobilized to participate in politics. That doesn't necessarily mean that they should participate freely or that they should, move according to their own goals and agendas. So it's more a sense of wanting the political community to be activated in some sense that I think you could argue is what Wang really means by democracy. So I think we do have to make some distinction here between how democracy is talked about in the traditions of Chinese Communist Party politics, which is the tradition that Wang comes from, versus the way that it's discussed, say, in a liberal democracy like the United States or Japan or elsewhere.
In late 1980s, Wang沪宁helped devise the theory of neo-authoritarianism, stating China needed a heavy-handed state-of-guide market reforms, arguing for a necessary concentration of central authority to carry reforms out. How accurate was his observation, and how was the result of China carrying it out?
China was at a moment, we're talking about the Deng Xiaoping era and immediately afterward, where the party was trying to master tensions that were very rapidly emerging between economic growth and political control. And so the question was, how does a country like Singapore, manage those competing tensions in a way that is useful for, or competing objectives in a way that's useful for China's leaders to think about as well. And there's lots of anecdotal evidence that Deng Xiaoping even was, somewhat influenced by this neo-authoritarian trend, right? And so that really, I think, is what Wang's neo-authoritarian moment, so to speak, and it was one that he shared with other intellectuals, is really about, how to, in a sense, open the political system. So, it's part of the reform and opening moment, open the system, broadly speaking, which is to open the political economy, but not to lose political control in a way that was identified as being, a kind of trigger for just a loss of control generally. So, it's how to have an orderly economic modernization, but it's not only that, it's how to have an economic modernization under a single party system of rule. And I think that was the main debate. And Wang obviously was a key part of it. You could argue now that, by the standards of the present, that debate has already been eclipsed by the answer, which is that if anything, the state is going to get down into the economy in a much more forceful and active way. That's the kind of Shiist moment that we're in right now.
Any negative impacts those market reforms brought to the West, and was the West misled by some of the nice work China said back then?
Well, we're talking about whole decades of history and very smart people on both sides, and at the same time, common interests on both sides of increasing China's prosperity, increasing, the prosperity of the firms and banks and others that were involved in this process of globalization, enriching, in China's case, a political elite that was sort of riding on this wave of opening to create its own economic power. And so I don't know that we can argue necessarily that people were misled so much as they were maybe, biased towards seeing these changes from a certain perspective because of how the interests lined up. At the same time, if there was one point that I think still, even now, is maybe not emphasized enough, it is that the Chinese Communist Party is still a Leninist institution with its own long history of organization and tactics, so to speak, for engaging with, audiences outside of the party. And to this day, there is an external messaging system that creates messages for the benefit of external audiences. And there's an internal messaging system that creates messages for the benefit of, insiders. And so I think that the lesson there is that when looking at China generally, one always has to be focused on both at the same time. It's important to understand how external communication is being crafted and what its intended effects are, which is a kind of classic propaganda question, and also be focused on the fact that there may be very different signals inside of the, that are coming from inside of the political system and that are intended for a very different audience. And so whether one is misled or not, you've at least got to arbitrage in some way the difference that exists between those signals, those different modes of communication.
How was Wang Huning infused the core of Marxism into the slogans he devised? And we know that he, however, believes in relativism in politics instead of absolutism. Any ambivalence in between, since Marxism seems to be the only truth for him? And does that, denying universal values from the West, creates legitimacy for the CCP?
Wang is arguably more of a Maoist than he is a Marxist. And what I mean by this is that Wang's focus on the role and importance of culture and his belief that if one can change belief systems, then one can ultimately change history is much more consistent with Mao, say during the era of the Great Leap Forward or during the era of the Cultural Revolution, than it is with Marx, for whom ideology was much more of an effect of deeper structural changes in the mode of production for society as a whole. So Wang's almost postmodern emphasis on ideas and the kind of functional role that ideas play in political systems is actually more of a kind of Leninist, Maoist, again, very, very kind of 1990s viewpoint, in the sense that the role of political culture and how it can be used to unify, how it can be used to mobilize, how it can be used to reinforce a sense of national community, if it's just like applied forcefully enough, that is how I would, in broad strokes, characterize Wang's thinking, and actually, some of the differences that lie there between his thinking and Marxism. On the other hand, he is an intellectual of the party. So his role, so to speak, is to think on behalf of the party and to think on behalf of the country. And so he's positioned that way. But that doesn't necessarily make him a Marxist. It makes him sort of something more of like, again, a party intellectual, and now at a very, very high level.
The CCP is going to host its 20th Party Congress later this year. Any doubts for Xi Jinping getting his third term? Will it become a bigger threat to the world's peace and prosperity if he does get the third term? And any chance that China might go backwards to the Mao era, as some analysts worry?
Well, I think there's almost, speaking of universal, I think there's almost universal consensus at this point that Xi will not step down at the 20th Party Congress, or maybe even, for the remainder of his natural life or his ability to remain in power. there's no historical precedent that I can think of in which a leader in his position naturally, decides to hand over the reins to someone else. I mean, Mao held on to power right down to the very bitter end, when he could barely speak or get out of bed. We're starting to see a resurgence of that kind of one-man rule around the world. And I think that is pretty concerning, because it's these same regimes that are committing the worst abuses against their own people and, are, in a sense, beginning to form quasi-alliances, like between China and Russia to, if we're not going to be part of the international community, so to speak, we're going to begin inflicting costs on that community, which I think is really a troubling trend. What it means for the rest of the world, I have a hard time avoiding the conclusion that in this present moment in which Xi has all but declared his unequivocal, his let's put it this way, his no limits support for Russia, which is a country now engaged in the violation of all kinds of international norms around conflict and is involved in some terrible war atrocities. That is not necessarily pointing in a more peaceful direction for Chinese foreign policy. And to be honest, it's not necessarily pointing in a very optimistic direction for people living in China today, because if she is committed to a more agonistic relationship with the West, like Russia, then there are a lot of things that follow, a more aggressive posture toward Taiwan, toward India, toward other players in the Asia Pacific, more focus on policies that can support the effort to rapidly militarize China's society and, create a country that's capable of engaging in and winning more conflicts in the future. And, this is, I think, something that could have a real impact even in 5 years' time. We already see from an economic perspective, from a kind of policy planning perspective, a real emphasis on militarization, on closing that gap, on innovation and technology, all being pushed toward, so-called dual use areas. So there are a lot of indicators here that point toward a kind of buildup, in the nuclear area, in missiles as well. And that's not a policy orientation that would change just because the 20th Party Congress happens. In fact, it may be reinforced by the 20th Party Congress, although typically real policy is made after the Congresses. But I think there's a lot to be focused on there. Let's put it that way, and a lot to be wary of as well for the rest of the world.